All right, welcome to Chapter 13's video lecture. Today we're going to talk about the spinal cord and the pathway of a reflex arc. But first we'll talk a little bit about the spinal cord. The functions of the spinal cord include conduction, where it contains bundles of nerve fibers that conduct the information up and down the cord. And this connects different levels of the trunk with each other and with the brain. And so this enables sensory information from your environment to reach the brain and the motor commands to reach the effectors, and that input that is received at one level could affect output at another level. It also has the function of neural integration, where there are pools of spinal neurons that receive input from multiple sources, integrate that information, and execute in an appropriate output. So for an example, the spinal cord could integrate the stretch sensation from a full bladder with cerebral input concerning appropriate time and place to take care of that, to urinate. It also has the function of locomotion, where not walking, it involves repetitive, coordinated contractions of several different muscle groups. The motor neurons initiate the walking direction and the speed, but the repetitive nature of the one foot in front of the other is actually coordinated by the central pattern generators in the spinal cord. And then last are the reflexes. And the spinal reflexes, which we'll talk about here in a second, play these vital roles in posture, motor coordination, and protective responses to pain or injury. And so those are the general functions of the spinal cord. Let's take a look at it in cross-section. So the spinal cord, just like the brain, is made up of two kinds of nervous tissue: gray matter and white matter. Now, gray matter, as you can see sort of in this darker brown color, that is what it looks like when it is stained, but if it was not stained, it has a relatively dull color because it doesn't contain a lot of myelin. And so what it does contain are the somas, dendrites, and other proximal parts of the axons of neurons. Gray matter is the site of synaptic contact between neurons, and therefore the gray matter is the site of all neural integration in the spinal cord. White matter, in contrast to the gray matter, has a bright pearly white appearance because it has an abundance of myelin. White matter is composed of bundles of axons that are called tracts that carry signals from one level of the central nervous system to another. Both gray and white matter have a lot of glial cells as well. So the reason that it looks sort of dark brown and tan instead of gray and white is that when you do histological study of nervous tissue, it is often stained with silver compounds. And those silver compounds give gray matter a brown tint and white matter a tan tint, as you can see in this image on the screen. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about gray matter. We can see here in the posterior view this orange color. This is the gray matter. Down here in the brown color is the gray matter. So the spinal cord, as you can see, it has a central core of gray matter, and it actually looks somewhat like a butterfly or an H shape when you look at it in cross-section. The core here consists mainly of two posterior or dorsal horns and two thick anterior or ventral horns. The right and the left sides of the gray matter are connected by a median bridge called the gray commissure. In the middle of the commissure is the central canal, which is collapsed in most areas in adults, but is open in some areas and is completely open in children. The posterior or dorsal horn receives sensory nerve fibers from the spinal nerves, which usually synapse with networks of interneurons in the horn. The anterior horn contains the large neurosomas of motor neurons whose axons lead out to the skeletal muscles. An additional lateral horn is visible on each side of the gray matter. These are present at the thoracic and lumbar levels of the spinal cord, and they contain neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, now we'll look at the white matter, which is everything outside of that butterfly shape. The white matter of the spinal cord surrounds the gray matter, and it consists of bundles of axons that course up and down the cord, and they provide avenues of communication between the different levels of the central nervous system. These bundles are arranged in 3 pairs called funiculi. There's a posterior or dorsal, a lateral, and anterior or ventral funiculus. Each column consists of subdivisions called tracts or fasciculi. Okay, let's break this down. So the dorsal horns are where the sensory nerve fibers synapse onto interneurons. The ventral horns are the location of somatic motor neuron cell bodies. The lateral horns are present on the thoracic and the lumbar levels of the spinal cord, and they contain the autonomic neurons. The posterior or dorsal root of the spinal nerve carries only sensory fibers, and the anterior or ventral root carries only motor fibers. Okay? Now let's talk about a reflex arc. And the first thing that I want to talk about is just generally the 5 functional components of a reflex arc. So, first of all, a reflex is an unlearned, rapid, involuntary, and predictable response. So, a reflex arc is the neural pathway that's involved in this reflex. And the reflex arc consists of 5 components. In a reflex, sensory information activates a receptor, and that receptor sends information to the central nervous system via a sensory neuron or afferent neuron. Some level of processing occurs in the integration center, and then the response is communicated to the effector target via the motor or efferent neuron. Now, this sounds a lot like the same model used to maintain homeostasis, and in fact, it is the same model. A receptor, a sensory neuron, an integrating center, a motor neuron, and an effector. Reflexes are a unique category of responses because they do not require the higher centers used for the conscious or voluntary responses. Instead, reflexes are involuntary, repeatable responses that occur fast. Now let's look at one particular. So let's say that in the skin, this looks like a nail through the skin, but let's say it's either a damage, a mechanical damage, or a heat. So the sensory receptors in the skin will sense either extreme temperature or some kind of damage in the skin, and they understand that this is going to be tissue damage happening. So to avoid further damage, information travels along the sensory fibers from the skin and into the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Once it's in the spinal cord, the sensory fibers synapse with a variety of interneurons that help to mediate the responses of the reflex. These responses include a strong initial withdrawal of the flexor muscle, which is caused by activation of the alpha motor neurons, inhibition of the extensor muscle, mediated through inhibitory interneurons, and sustained contraction of the flexor, which is mediated by the spinal cord neuronal circuit. Or, in other words, the receptor sends the signals to the sensory neurons, the integrating center makes a decision, which sends down to the motor neuron, which then goes to the effector, which causes you to have a reflex, move away from what is causing you pain. So, somatic reflexes, or the reflexes of the body, involve these unconscious skeletal muscle motor responses. In doing so, These reflexes utilize some of the same lower motor neurons used to control skeletal muscle during conscious movement. But because reflexes are so quick, it makes sense that the somatic reflexes are often meant to protect us from injury. As examples, reflexes contribute to the maintenance of balance, rapid withdrawal of your hand or foot from damaging stimuli, things of that nature. A common example of a somatic reflex, is the knee jerk reflex that is elicited by the rubber hammer striking against the patellar tendon during a physical exam. When that hammer strikes, it stretches the tendon, which pulls on the quadriceps femoris muscle, and because bones and tendons do not typically pull muscles, the muscle thinks, quote unquote, that it is stretching very rapidly. And the reflex acts to counteract this stretch, and so in doing so, the knee jerks forward. Okay? So that is all for this video and this chapter. We'll see you in the next chapter.